What if you could prepare the same meals that help people survive the Great Depression, but with a modern twist for your pantry? Today, I'll show you how to create shelf-stable versions of iconic dishes that were essential for making ends meet. Hey guys, it's Clara with Wicked Prepared. Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we're diving into the resourcefulness of the Great Depression, a time when creativity and ingenuity were crucial for survival. I'll be guiding you through preparing shelf-stable versions of classic Depression-era meals that provided sustenance when resources were scarce. Join me as we honor the past and learn practical ways to stock our pantries for any situation. The Great Depression was a decade in American history marked with poverty and suffering. They say history repeats itself, and I think it's fair to say many people are suffering financially today as well. With food and housing prices through the roof and an overall cost of living crisis, it's become a struggle for many to afford everyday necessities, much less put aside extra for emergencies. We once again need simple, frugal recipes like those our grandmothers used. I had the inspiration to fuse together two strategies: low-cost Depression-era meals transformed into shelf-stable emergency meal kits. These meals in a bag, as I call them, contain everything you need to make a complete meal, including any water necessary. So whether you're faced with an extended power outage, a personal, financial, or medical crisis, or even just an evening without dinner plans, you have meals all ready to go. Even if you had to evacuate your home, you could easily grab a few bags and bring them along. Today, I'm going to show you 5 meal-in-a-bag versions of classic Great Depression meals. Stay tuned till the end of the video and I'll break down the total cost of each meal. Let's get started. Our first meal is Hoover Stew. Herbert Hoover was the sitting president when the stock market crashed and the Great Depression began. Many hallmarks that represented the poverty of the era were named after the president, including this inexpensive, filling, and surprisingly tasty stew. These are the ingredients that we need for our Hoover Stew. Now, Hoover Stew would typically start with hot dogs as the protein source because that was a really inexpensive meat that they could get during the Great Depression. And it still is a very inexpensive source of meat. Even nowadays, I can usually still find a 1-pound pack of hot dogs for around $1 or less if I really look. But today for shelf stability, we're going to be using these Vienna bites, which is basically sliced hot dogs in a can, so they're shelf stable. The next ingredient in the Hoover Stew is going to be macaroni, which is going to be a very inexpensive source of carbohydrates for this dish. And this is just about 2 cups of macaroni that I just put into a pint jar. I just pretty much filled the jar up so that I knew it would be about 2 cups. The amount is not going to be super picky here on this recipe because this is a soup, this is a stew. It can be a little bit more liquidy or a little bit less liquidy and it will be fine. We're also going to be using 2 cans of stewed tomatoes. You could use any tomatoes you wanted, diced tomatoes, Italian style tomatoes. There's lots of different variations you could use to change this dish up, but I really like the stewed tomatoes in this. And stewed tomatoes, if you look at the ingredients, they do have a little bit of sugar added and some other things that give them a little bit different flavor, and I think a little bit more flavor than your typical diced tomatoes. We're also going to be using some canned corn in this dish, some whole kernel corn, and I'm going to be using a can of chicken broth for my liquid. Now this is going to add a little bit of cost to this dish. Back in the Depression, they would typically have just boiled the macaroni in some water, drained it off, and added it to the other ingredients. But I'm going to be doing this as a 1-pot pasta meal where the pasta is going to cook right in the dish and there's not going to be any liquid that we drain off. That's a good way to avoid wasting a precious resource if you're in an emergency situation. But the broth will give it a little bit of extra flavor. Now, during the Great Depression, if they weren't using plain water, they might have used a homemade stock or broth that they made themselves, or you could use a bouillon cube. Those were available back then, and it's a much more economical way to get some broth. If you were to do that, you'd want to make sure to include a bottle of water in your bag so that you have the water to substitute for the liquid in the broth. Another thing you could add, and I see a lot of recipes for Hoover Stew that use this, is you could use a can of beans, any type of beans. Pinto beans would be good. Any type of beans is going to add some extra protein and some extra nutrition and some extra fiber to this dish. A lot of people do add that. I'm keeping mine simple without the beans this time because I have some family members who aren't a big fan of beans. And to me, it doesn't really seem to go with the dish. But back in the Great Depression, a lot of the focus was just on nutrition and calories and filling people's bellies, and sometimes flavor and, cohesiveness of a dish went to the wayside. The one other thing I am going to add is some salt and pepper. I'm just going to be using some salt and pepper packets. You can get these from restaurants if you save them. You can see these are from Wendy's. I have no idea how long these have been around because I can't remember the last time I've been to a Wendy's. You can purchase salt and pepper packets if you don't have any and you can't get any from family members, but that would add some extra expense. And sometimes people just count on the fact that they're going to have salt and pepper in their kitchen, and most people that they might gift a bag to would have salt and pepper, but I do like to include pretty much everything in my bag, so I'm going to throw in some salt and pepper packets. That's the great thing about a dish like this, is you could really change it up with different seasonings and make it into any variety of different flavors. Now let's go ahead and get these into our bag. Now I have talked a lot about the bags I use and why I like them in some of my other meal in a bag videos, so I'm not going to really go into a whole lot of detail about the bags today. I do have a playlist of all my emergency meal kits or meals in a bag that you can check out if you're interested. And I will have information about these bags, where I get them, everything I use with them, down in the description box below the video. I always put all my sources down there for things that I talk about in my videos. I'm going to start with my Vienna bites, and next my stewed tomatoes. I'm going to add my chicken broth and my corn and my macaroni. This is 2 cups of macaroni in a pint-sized mason jar. You could do this any way you wanted. You could put this into a Ziploc bag, especially if you weren't going to be keeping this on your shelf for a really long time. Put it into Mylar bags, anything you wanted. You could even use an empty peanut butter jar. And then, of course, my salt and pepper packets, and we are ready to go. Now this meal is ready to go on the shelf and be ready whenever we need it. But today I'm not going to put it on the shelf. I'm going to prepare it so you can see how this meal comes together and what it looks like when it's finished. This meal is going to cook up really quickly and easily on the butane emergency stove. Just need a decent size soup pot or Dutch oven. Now, typically making this dish, if you were making it with hot dogs, you would start by browning up your hot dogs or frying up your hot dogs in the bottom of your pan. But because we're not using actual hot dogs, we're going to do this as just a dump and boil meal, basically. But I am going to start with my tomatoes because I might want those broken up just a little bit more than what they come in the can. And so I'm going to put these in first so I can give them a good mashing without ruining any of the other ingredients. That's one important thing to note. These have some pop tops on these cans. Most of my cans have pop tops, but not all cans will. So you want to make sure that you have a good manual can opener with your emergency cooking supplies. Or you can even include the small military can openers right in the bag. You can get a bunch of those really inexpensively, so you can just throw one in each bag if you want. Now, what I like to do with something like this is use my meat masher to break up these tomatoes. Of course, during the Great Depression, something like this wouldn't have existed. So you can certainly just break up your tomatoes with your spoon against the edge of your pot. I do that sometimes as well. Or you could just leave them in the larger pieces. Some people like it like that. All right, that's good enough. I don't want them to be super small and pureed. I want some chunks, but I just didn't want the really big slices. So now we can go ahead and put in all the rest of our ingredients. I'm going to go ahead with my corn. I'm not going to drain these vegetables because all that liquid is something that we can use in our dish. It's really just water and salt, and so it's going to add a little bit of flavor, a little bit more moisture, and it's not going to waste any liquid or any water, which is a precious resource during an emergency. The great thing about this dish is because it is a stew, it can be as soupy or as thick as we want it to be, so it's not going to matter if we have slightly different amounts of liquid. I'm going to add my Vienna bites next, and I'm going to do the same thing with that liquid. I'm going to add it all into the dish. That's going to just add some flavor. Now, if you wanted, you could cut these Vienna bites up into smaller pieces so that they had a little bit more in each bite of the stew. That's what they did a lot during the Great Depression, was chopping things up like this really small so that it could distribute throughout and everybody got more in every bite. You also could include a second can if you wanted more meat in your dish. Next, I've got my broth, and that's the last thing we're going to add besides the macaroni. We're not going to add any salt and pepper right now because I'm not sure if we will need it, especially with the liquid from the sausages. So I'm going to go ahead and light the stove and bring this up to a boil or a simmer before I add the pasta. What I should have done, but I forgot, is I would usually use that broth to rinse the last little bit of juice out of these tomato cans so that none of it gets wasted. Of course, putting a lid on your pot is always a good idea because it's going to preserve a little more fuel because it's going to hold the heat in. All right, you can see this is starting to simmer, so it's going to be an okay time to add the pasta. Now I'm going to stir this in. I'm going to put the lid on, and I'm going to simmer this for the time it takes to cook the pasta, which isn't going to be that long. But one thing to remember is that if you are short on fuel, you can actually do this by just stirring in the dry pasta, putting a lid on it, and letting it sit until the pasta has completely softened. That can work even better if you put it in some kind of a thermal cooker, like maybe inside of a small cooler, and wrap a comforter around the pot to hold the heat in. You can cook a lot of things that way and save yourself on fuel if you're worried about running out of fuel. You do want to make sure to stir this occasionally just to keep that pasta from sticking to the bottom, especially in the beginning. And once it comes back up to a boil or a simmer, you can lower the heat so that you don't worry about that as much. All right, so this has been simmering for about 10 minutes, and I think the pasta is done, and it's looking pretty good and thickened up. I'm going to go ahead and turn the heat off, and I'm going to scoop out just a small dish of this to give it a taste so that I can decide if I want to add some salt and pepper or if I want to kind of leave that up to each individual person to add to their own dish. This, of course, is a dish that the longer it sits, the thicker it's going to get, because these macaronis are going to keep absorbing liquid as it sits. So if you let this sit for a little bit, it's going to be a lot thicker. And then if you have leftovers, it's going to be probably very thick the next day. You know what? I think this is pretty good just as it is. Remember, we added the liquid with the Vienna bites and the liquid with the corn. So we did add some salt, plus the broth had salt. So if you need to avoid salt or have less salt, you could use no salt added versions of many of these things. I'm not sure if you would find Vienna bites with less salt, but you might find some sort of canned meat product with lower sodium. This is actually pretty tasty. I'm surprised. I'm excited to see what Mr. Wicked Prepared thinks about it. Now, the great thing about this is that if you did have extra mouths to feed and more people to feed, you needed to stretch a dish like this on less money, you could add a lot more pasta to this. Adding more pasta is going to be very inexpensive. I calculated the price of the 2 cups of pasta I put in was about 48 cents. So you could add a lot more pasta and then just add extra water. Even if you didn't have broth or, seasonings, you could just add some bouillon or just extra salt and pepper to stretch out the flavor. And you could make this dish serve a lot more people. And if you didn't have money for the meat, you could leave that out. I mean, I think anybody who's ever been poor has probably had just macaroni with tomatoes. That is a pretty decent dish, and that's going to fill your belly too. So you could make this dish even less expensively, and you could actually make it stretch to feed a lot more people. But I bet this would feed 6 people with what I've got here, especially if you're feeding a family with small children. You're going to be able to feed a lot more bellies than you are if you're feeding a bunch of hungry men. Next up is another classic of the era, peanut butter bread. This simple bread recipe uses peanut butter as the fat in place of more expensive and harder to come by butter, and it became one of the most common staples during the Great Depression. Most bread recipes require yeast and eggs, but not this one. Every ingredient in this bread can last years on its own and is inexpensive, making it great for people living through the Depression and great for the Prepper Pantry. What we need for the peanut butter bread is, of course, peanut butter. Now, this is a jar of peanut butter from Dollar Tree, so it's a 10-ounce jar. This is the size of jar that they sell. So it's a good price, and it's also the perfect size that we're going to use the whole jar. Because when you do a meal in a bag like this, you don't want to have to open something up. You want to have a whole shelf-stable package in your bag. So sometimes Dollar Tree can be a great resource for finding smaller quantities of something in a sealed package. This one is actually their honey peanut butter. I like this because it gives it a little bit of extra sweetness. They do have regular peanut butter too that you could use if you didn't want to have the extra sweetness. Then I've got a can of evaporated milk. This is just a 12-ounce can of evaporated milk. And then I've got all of my dry ingredients are in this 1.5-pint mason jar. So what I did here is I just took a 1.5-pint mason jar and I added all my dry ingredients into this jar. So I'm doing a 1/4 cup of sugar. And then I'm going to add in 2 cups of flour. So I'm going to put in my first cup of flour. And I'm actually going to put my baking powder in next because that's going to keep the baking powder in the middle of the flour and just keep air from getting to it, keep the salt from getting to it. And I think it will make it last longer because this is one of the components in this bag that will not last as long as some others. So you will want to rotate some items out sooner if you don't use this bag up within probably a couple of years. I'm doing 4 teaspoons of baking powder. And I just use this strainer to just break down any clumps that might be in my baking soda or baking powder. I do this whenever I use those 2 ingredients. This is baking powder. Then my 2nd cup of flour. And then a 1/2 teaspoon of salt. And that's it. This is a little too much ingredients to fit inside of a pint jar, and that's why I use this 1.5 pints. Now you could use something besides a mason jar to store these ingredients in, depending on how long you were going to keep it on the shelf. You could even use something like a Ziploc bag if you thought you would use it up a little bit sooner. Keep in mind with a recipe like this, not everything is going to last as long as, say, a recipe where all of the ingredients are canned, because canned food lasts practically indefinitely. So in here we do have baking powder, which could lose its leavening power after a while. Peanut butter doesn't have a super long shelf life, they say, but I gotta tell you, I have never had peanut butter go bad on me, and I've kept it long after its date. So I think that we're gonna be okay with this, but this might be a meal that you might wanna cycle through a little more frequently than something that, say, is all canned goods. All right, now to get the peanut butter bread in the bag. This one is so simple. We've got the evaporated milk, we've got the peanut butter, and we've got the mason jar with the dry ingredients, and that is it. This one is ready to go on the shelf. But instead of putting it on the shelf, I'm going to fix it up and show you how it comes together and how it looks when it's done. We're going to mix it all up in one bowl, of course, because it was a Depression era recipe. They probably didn't have mixers back then. It's a super simple, easy recipe to mix up. I do have my oven preheating to 325 degrees. This is a recipe that bakes in the oven. So if you don't have a way to bake with the power out, then this might not be a great recipe for you in a grid down emergency, but there's lots of other times that you could use it. There are several ways you can bake without electricity, and I will have those listed down in the description box below the video if you want to check that out. Another thing you can sometimes do with a quick bread or a batter bread is oftentimes, I haven't tried it with this bread, but oftentimes you can put it onto a skillet like a pancake or something and just cook it up as a skillet bread like that. So I'm going to start by emptying this whole jar of peanut butter into the bowl. Now, since this is not the Great Depression and it's not a grid down emergency, and I do have a microwave to use, I like to soften it by just putting it in the microwave for about 30 seconds, stirring it one time in between so it doesn't really melt or burn. You don't want this to get super hot or anything like that. Just soften it a little bit. Now, if you wanted to soften it and you didn't have access to a microwave, you could do it in a double boiler or something like that very easily. You can see that softened up nicely. All right, so now that this is softened up, I'm going to go ahead and add my evaporated milk. It does say shake well, so I'm going to shake it up. I'm going to go ahead and add my milk into my peanut butter. And I found it works best to use a whisk to get this to incorporate smoothly. It's not too difficult. You could certainly do it with a spoon or whatever other utensil you had if you didn't have a whisk handy. Right there, that looks pretty smooth. And now all that's left to do is to add our dry ingredients and incorporate those well until it's all smooth. It smells very good, very peanut buttery. Smells like peanut butter cookies. All right, so that looks pretty smooth and well combined. You don't want to mix too much and make it tough. I don't see any clumps of flour and I don't see any wet spots. So I'm going to go ahead and get the bread pan. I'm going to use an 8x4" bread pan today. In the past, I've used a 9x5 bread pan. That works fine. The loaf is a little bit shorter. I think it will fit in the smaller pan, and then I would have a taller, narrower loaf. And if for some reason it doesn't fit, I'll just put it in the other pan. I am going to give this a quick spray with some cooking spray, but I don't really think that's necessary a lot of the time when I do these baked in pan meal in a bags. I will not spray the pan because that's something that you might not have on hand. Of course, in the Great Depression, they wouldn't have had cooking spray, but you could grease this pan with anything. Or like I mentioned, I think it would be fine if you didn't grease it. The other thing you can do when you do a meal in a bag like this is you can put in a disposable foil pan. That way, if you are in a grid down emergency without hot water and electricity, you don't have to wash extra dishes by hand. And if you gift the meal to somebody, then you don't have to worry about if they have the right size pan. All right, I'm just going to go ahead and get my batter into the pan. Once it's spread evenly in the pan, you can just go ahead and make a little mark down the middle of the loaf, just because they tend to naturally split, and this will kind of help it. So I just do that with my scraper. I'm going to go ahead and put this in the oven. Like I mentioned, it's 325. When I have baked it in a 9x5 loaf pan, it really only took about 45 minutes. I'm not sure if it'll take any longer with this smaller pan because it's deeper, but we'll see. I'll see you back here when it's done. Here is our peanut butter bread, fresh out of the oven. It tested done. You can see it did puff up over the top of the pan, but that is just fine. I'm going to go ahead and put this on a rack, and I'm going to cool it for maybe 10 or so minutes and then get it out of the pan and let it cool the rest of the way before we slice into it. Now let's cut into the peanut butter bread. Just going to cut it right down the middle so that we can see how it looks. That looks really nice. It rose a lot. Feels nice and moist. It smells very peanut buttery. Now this could very easily be, it's not super sweet. It smells like a peanut butter cookie, but it's not as sweet as a peanut butter cookie. So I think this would be a great breakfast food and possibly even a lunch food. Not really a dessert. So I thought about it and I thought you could put something in the bag like honey. I think this bread would be really good with some honey on it. I found this cute little bottle of honey at the Dollar Tree. And it says it's 100% pure honey. It's not the honey syrup that's cut with other things. Natural honey, it says on the ingredients. The other thing would be some jam. So this is a strawberry banana jam, which I thought would be super, super yummy with this bread. And you could even do peanut butter and jelly sandwiches with this. So if you want something to put in the bag with it, be creative, but I think some honey or some jam would be a good choice. All right, so we're going to try one drizzled with honey. And the other one I'm going to try with some of this strawberry banana jam. This is so good. All right, let's see. Very good. Will be good with some banana too. Let's try this. Wow. The peanut butter bread by itself is not bad, but it's kind of plain, but this really, really elevates it. These are two delicious breakfast options. And if you added some peanut butter and made a sandwich, you'd have a good lunch too. This next meal is called a poor man's meal. This term can actually be used to describe many different combinations of ingredients, but I most often see it referring to a dish made with hot dogs and potatoes. Hot dogs were a very popular way to incorporate protein or meat into the diet during the era because they were cheap and easily accessible. Potatoes were another very prevalent food during the Great Depression. They were very inexpensive, and although I don't think of potatoes as being very nutritious, they were compared to many of the other foods that were available to Depression-era cooks. They were also cheap and easy to grow for rural families, and they stored well through the winter. My grandmother was born in 1933 in rural Maine, and I asked her the other day if she remembers what her family ate during the Great Depression and during her childhood. The first thing that she mentioned was potatoes. We ate lots of potatoes, she said. They would harvest them and throw them under the barn, cover them up with dirt, and then dig them up whenever they needed them throughout the winter. Since not everyone has a barn these days, we're going to go with shelf-stable canned potatoes and dry potato flakes for these recipes. For the poor man's meal, we are going to be using potatoes, very cheap, very classic Depression ingredient. And I'm going to be using this can of luncheon meat, which is basically generic Spam. Now, traditionally, this dish was made with hot dogs, like so many others, but for shelf-stable version of hot dogs, this time I'm going to use the luncheon meat. Spam was definitely popular during the Great Depression. I don't think they had a great value brand, but this is the cheapest thing available to me, and that's the way they would have done it during the Great Depression. The only other ingredient I'm including in this meal is a little bit of oil. Now, this is actually olive oil, and I got this from Dollar Tree, so you can see it's only, well, it's 5 point something fluid ounces. This is way more oil than I need, but this is just what I'm doing because it's easiest. What you could definitely do is take something small like a baby food jar and just pour some oil out of your big bottle into that and put it in the bag. That would be the easiest and cheapest way to do it. They also sell things like this, little packets of ghee. I have used these sometimes, but honestly, these one packet is going to be almost as expensive as this whole bottle of oil from the Dollar Tree. So my thinking is I can just use the little bit of oil I need out of this bottle and then put it in the next bag if I have several bags there that need oil. Or like I said, you could decant this into a small amount into a small glass jar and put it right with your meal. I have had bottles of oil in my pantry open for years probably, and they are fine. Nothing happens to them. So it would be fine for a few years in your meal in a little glass jar, as long as the jar starts off clean. The other thing you could do with the oil is just assume that you're going to have oil on hand in your kitchen, or whoever makes this meal is going to have oil on hand in their kitchen. A lot of people just assume things like oil, salt, and pepper are always going to be available. I just don't like to assume that, especially because I know a lot of people give these as gifts or give these as blessings to people who are in need of a meal, and you never know what they're going to have on hand. And of course, I am going to add some salt and pepper packets because this might need some extra seasoning. Some people will add a little bit of tomato sauce to the poor man's meal. I don't like the idea of that combination of the meat and potatoes with the tomato sauce. That's just not something that sounds good to me, and I've seen plenty of people do this meal without it. If you had some fresh onion, you could chop it up and add to this as well. You could also add something like dehydrated chopped onion. This is from the Dollar Tree. You would not need this whole container, just a little bit in a container or a baggie. But I am going to do it just like this. Let's go ahead and get this in the bag. Let's go ahead and fill this bag. I'm going to add my 2 cans of diced potatoes and my can of luncheon meat and my little container of oil. And this meal is ready to go on the shelf. All right, to fix up this poor man's meal, I've got to start by chopping up my Spam or lunch meat, whatever you want to call it, into small dices. I'm just going to dice this up real quickly. If you dice it up super small, well, maybe not super small, but not super big, then it's going to stretch a little bit farther. Incidentally, there are all different varieties of this luncheon meat now, so you can get low sodium. You can get light, which I think is lower in fat. You can get turkey luncheon meat. You can get bacon flavored. I saw a Korean barbecue flavor, not in the generic, but so you could really do a lot to either make this meal a little bit healthier, not a lot healthier. I'm not going to tell you that this luncheon meat is going to be healthy no matter which way you slice it, but maybe a little bit healthier if you need to eat a little bit lower sodium or lower fat. And you can also vary up the flavors quite a bit. A bacon flavored luncheon meat would make this a great breakfast dish. I think this would be a great breakfast dish even without the bacon flavor. And they have spicy luncheon meat, all sorts of different varieties. All right, our meat is chopped. Now the potatoes are already diced, so there's nothing to do here. Just open them up. These ones don't have a flip top, but a lot of them do. There is liquid in these cans, and you've probably seen I typically like to use or include the liquid in the cans and not just dump it and throw it away, but I have no use for liquid in this recipe. And this is just going to be potato liquid, so these contain potatoes, water, salt, and calcium chloride, which is a firming agent so that the potatoes don't get mushy in the can. So I don't even know if this water would be great to save. Often if you drain the water off of canned fruits, canned vegetables, canned meats, you can use it in a different recipe or even just drink it if you're in an emergency and your water is at a premium. Usually the water from a canned vegetable is just going to be water and salt and maybe some of the flavoring of that vegetable. But because this one has that additional ingredient, I probably will just dump it. I'm going to be using my butane burner for the poor man's meal, and I'm just going to be using this big fry pan. The best thing to use would be cast iron, and that's probably what would be used during the Great Depression, but this is what I've got right handy, so this is what I'm going to use. Just going to go ahead and put a little bit of this oil into the bottom of the pan and get the heat on. When this starts to get hot, I'm going to add my meat. This burner is about 8,000 BTUs, and it is a pretty hot, strong burner. So I'm going to go ahead and add my meat in right now. This is actually quite a bit of meat for $2. And because of the salt, this actually includes some of the seasoning that we would need for this meal. We probably won't need to add much just because the meat is already salty. It's also possible there would have been enough fat in this meat to actually make this dish without using any oil. All right, this meat is starting to brown, so I'm going to go ahead and add my potatoes. And then we're just going to toss this around and let this fry up until the potatoes also start to brown. Okay, these potatoes are starting to brown up a little bit, and they actually don't really have to brown up because they're all cooked and they're all tender. They started out that way. They're very hot. And I think this is starting to look really good. I also think because of the salt in the meat and the salt in the canned potatoes, it might not even really need a lot of salt, or that might be something I want to leave up to the person who's eating it. I'm just going to give them a try and see what I think. I do think that can probably be pretty good for most people. I'm just going to put a little bit of salt. This says sea salt. It's Wendy's, but now these are very small servings of salt. I looked up what one of these was, and it's not very much at all. But I'm just going to put one of those. I am going to put some pepper, though, because I feel like that is something we want in this, and anyone would enjoy some pepper. I'm going to go ahead and mix all that in. We're going to call that ready to serve. Like I mentioned before, some people would throw a little tomato sauce or salsa or something in that. I think it looks great just the way it is. Maybe a little ketchup is what I would do, or a little hot sauce. So you actually could throw in some ketchup packets or some hot sauce packets if that's something that you thought you might like with this. The next meal is going to be a classic chipped beef gravy. This was traditionally served over toast, but I'm going to be using a different, more shelf-stable option for this meal kit. During the Great Depression, rural families were actually better off than families in cities and more urban areas because they were more self-sufficient and able to provide a lot of their own food. That's something we should all take a lesson from today. For everyone else, cheap and shelf-stable was the name of the game when it came to things like meat and dairy. Chipped beef and canned evaporated milk fit the bill for this meal. There are many other variations of this meal. Besides the cream chipped beef, you may have eaten salmon pea wiggle like my grandmother used to make, or cream tuna on toast. There's also another version made with Hamburg that has a more colorful and less appropriate name, but we can refer to it by its acronym SOS. But today I am making the classic chipped beef version. For the chipped beef gravy meal, of course, I've got my chipped beef, my dried beef. Small container of that, I've got a 12-ounce can of evaporated milk. Here I've got a small 4-ounce mason jar, and in this jar I put a 1/3 of a cup of flour, a 1/2 of a teaspoon of salt, and a 1/2 of a teaspoon of pepper. So that's all the dry ingredients we need. Of course, depending on what you have available and how long you plan on keeping this meal on your shelf, there's different options besides the mason jar. You could use a baby food jar, you could use a Mylar small bag like this, or a storage bag like this. Or, of course, you could just use a Ziploc baggie. I've also got some water. This is going to do double duty. We need a little bit of this water for the actual gravy. And then we need some of this water to rinse the beef because a lot of people like to rinse some of the extra salt out of this beef. This is really, really salty. You can see how much sodium is in this. So rinsing the beef can get rid of some of that salt. And then I have got crackers to serve this over top of. Normally, you hear chipped beef on toast, and that's how I would have this when I was a child and we had this dish. Just for ease of shelf stability, I'm going to be using crackers because this is something that people do put a lot of meals of this type over, like a creamed gravy over toast. Sometimes people put them over crackers as well. These are all ready to go. They don't need any cooking, and they're shelf stable for a while. You probably don't want to keep the crackers on your shelf much longer than about a year and then swap them out for another new pack. But some other options if you don't want to serve this over crackers, I do have a really simple French bread mix in a jar recipe that's a just add water recipe that you could add into this if you think you'd be able to bake some bread. You could serve it over mashed potatoes. This is a just add water mashed potato pouch you could throw in. You could serve it over biscuits. This is a just add water biscuit mix that you could add to your bag. And you could also serve it over some noodles by throwing a bag of noodles into your bag. So there's lots of different options for this meal or any other type of cream gravy over toast type of meal that you would make. Now let's get these ingredients in the bag. I am going to start with my crackers. Next, I'm going to add my milk, my dry ingredients, my dried beef, and my bottle of water. And now this meal is all ready to go on the shelf. But let's prepare it and see how it turns out. Before I get started, I am going to soak my beef for just a little bit so that I can get some of the extra salt off. I'm going to be using some of this water. Now, I do need some of the water for my gravy, so I'm going to use probably just about half of this bottle or no more. That's pretty good. And now I'm just going to let this soak and kind of mix it around a little bit just for just a few minutes to get some of the salt off. Now the water that comes out of this when I drain it off is just going to be some salty water. So you could save that to use in a different recipe, maybe a soup or something that you would have added salt to. You can utilize some of the salt that we're taking out of this dish, because that's definitely something that they would have done during the Great Depression, is used every little bit of what they had and not wasted anything. This water would even probably be good to use as part of some pasta boiling water. All right, so now that my beef has soaked and gotten some of that salt off, I'm going to go ahead and slice it up into little ribbons. Now I'm going to go ahead and set this aside while we create the white sauce that it's going to go into. Now typically you would make your white sauce starting with a roux by browning your flour in some butter. But we are not using butter today because we're keeping this all shelf stable and all Depression era friendly. So I am simply going to blend the dry ingredients, which is the flour, salt, and pepper, right into the milk. As long as I blend it in when it's cold, it will mix in and it will thicken that just as well as if we had put it in with some butter. It just might not have as much richness. Then I'm just going to add the evaporated milk right to those dry ingredients and whisk them up really well. And I'm also going to use some of the rest of my water to rinse out the can of milk and add some extra water in with this milk. So I'm going to try to fill this can about a little over halfway full, probably about halfway to 2/3 of the way full. I think that will be about good right there. Just use that to rinse out the rest of the milk from the can and try to get this flour whisked in really well, just so we don't have any lumps. And this should all be done with the heat off. All right, once I'm sure I've got all those dry ingredients whisked in well and there's no more clumps in the corner of the pan, I'm going to go ahead and turn on my heat. Around medium high. I want to bring this to a boil. I can bring this to a boil fairly quickly. I just don't want to scorch it on the bottom. And I will whisk this pretty regularly just to keep it from sticking. Now these bubbles will subside. They're just from me shaking the can of milk before we got started, because that's what it says on the can, shake well before opening. Starting to feel this begin to thicken, so it might be about to come to a boil. Once this does boil, I will just cook it for about a minute just to cook the flour, make sure it's good and cooked, and then it'll be ready to add our meat. All right, that's been bubbling for about a minute, so I know that that is good and cooked and ready to go. So now we're just going to add in our beef. Start to stir this in and heat this very gently. And there is our chipped beef gravy ready to go over our crackers or toast or whatever you might have to serve this over. Now this makes a pretty thick gravy, and that is a matter of preference. So you can make this thinner if you want. I did have a little bit of water left in my bottle, so if you want a thinner gravy, add more water. You could fill that evaporated milk can right up to the top if you want. Another thing that I think is a matter of personal preference is rinsing the beef. Whether you rinse the beef or not depends on how you want your dish to taste and how much sodium you want to consume. Because honestly, I don't think my mother ever used to rinse the beef. What I remember about this dish from when I was small was it being very salty, and that was actually what I liked about it. And when I rinse the beef, it's not nearly as salty as what I remember. So that's another matter of personal preference. Let me just say, I did buy this pack of crackers at the Dollar Tree. That's usually a good place to find like smaller packs like this, if you don't need a whole big pack with 4 sleeves. But these crackers are actually wrapped in this nice sort of mylar material, and they seem like they would maintain their freshness longer than the other type of cracker sleeve I've seen. So that's a plus for Dollar Tree. All right, let's add some of our gravy onto our crackers. Now, because this is very rich, a little bit can go a long way. So this can feed quite a few people. That is pretty tasty. Of course, this does not contain any vegetable. So if you wanted, you could always throw in a can of canned vegetable into your bag so that you had a side dish for this. Like a can of peas, a can of green beans, something like that I think would go really well with this. But this is a good, simple dinner. For the final meal today, I'm making a simple, classic potato soup. Potatoes were such a staple for people during the Great Depression, just like my grandmother. Her family also had a dairy cow, so they would have fresh milk. During the 1920s and 30s, commercially canned evaporated milk became an easily accessible and relatively inexpensive option for everyone. Interestingly, if you try to search the smallest variety of foods needed for survival, you'll find a lot about milk and potatoes. Together, they're complementary and they provide most of the essential nutrients that we need to survive. Apparently, you could survive quite well on just those two foods, ideally adding a little bit of greens for a few missing nutrients. So I thought this potato soup, which consists of mainly those two foods and a bit of seasoning, would be a very fitting Depression-era survival meal. For the potato soup, I am using two different kinds of potatoes. I'm using a thing of mashed and a thing of canned diced potatoes. The reason for the two potatoes is because, if someone were making this during the Great Depression, chances are they would be using fresh potatoes. You could get a sack of potatoes really, really affordably. And a lot of people in rural areas would have grown their own potatoes, like my grandmother's family. So starting from fresh potatoes, the potatoes would have been cooked in the broth and then mashed to leave sort of a chunky consistency. So there was some potatoes that were mashed and there were some chunks still left in. So it was a smooth soup with some chunks. So this is just a way to sort of try to duplicate that, where we're starting with shelf-stable potatoes instead of fresh potatoes. And then the only other ingredients that I'm going to have are a carton of chicken broth. So this is a quart. Once again, if you wanted to make this a little more affordable, you could use water and bouillon cubes. And the other thing is another 12-ounce can of evaporated milk. You can see this makes a lot of appearances in Depression-era cooking. And of course, I am going to add my salt and pepper because this is going to need some seasonings. I am using a buttery flavored, this is a flavored mashed potato mix. So this is a just add water mix that would be complete potatoes. You don't have to add anything to this like the plain potato flakes, but you have to add salt, milk, and butter. This is great for shelf-stable cooking. And it's going to also add some seasoning. It's going to have that buttery flavor and that saltiness to it. There's also salt in the broth, but if we need more salt and pepper, we'll have this. I think it's never a bad idea to include these type of packets in any meal in a bag that you do, because then if someone's eating and they have a preference for a little more salt and pepper, they can add it themselves. The one thing about this meal is these potato packets, because of the seasonings and the flavorings, aren't going to last as long as plain potato flakes or as some of these canned items would last. So this is one where you're going to want to rotate out at least this part of the meal if you haven't used it within, a year or two. Usually we use these here and there when we have a really busy day and we need a quick meal, so they'll get used. You can also donate them and start fresh. But keep an eye out for certain ingredients that aren't going to have as long of a shelf life as others. Let's get this put in the bag. I'm going to add my carton of chicken broth, my can of diced potatoes, my can of evaporated milk, my packet of mashed potatoes, and of course my salt and pepper. One more meal ready to go on the pantry shelf. But you guessed it, we're not going to put it on the shelf today. We're going to cook it up and see how it comes out. I'm just going to use my big soup pot, and I'm going to start by adding my mashed potato flakes. And then I'm going to add some of my chicken broth. I'm not going to add it all just yet. Now I'm going to add my evaporated milk. Now that's where the rest of the broth is going to come in. I am going to use this to rinse out the remainder of the milk in my can so that I don't waste any. And then finally, I'm going to add in my diced potatoes for the chunks that we need. Now, I am not going to use the liquid in this can like I typically would, just because of that added ingredient, the calcium chloride. I looked that up and it's not considered harmful to eat in small amounts, but it's not really supposed to be good for you. So I'm going to drain this off. Now, obviously, if you have your own home canned potatoes, you could use those in any of the dishes in place of the store-bought. A pint of potatoes would be about equivalent to this. Now I've just got to get the heat on and get this brought up to temperature. All right, you can see the soup is starting to bubble. That's all we really had to do with this, was heat it through, because everything's already cooked. I'm just going to give it a little bit of a taste so that I can adjust the seasonings. Wow. That is actually really good. And I think it's got plenty of salt just with what was in the potatoes and the broth. Plenty of salt. I am going to add pepper, partly for flavor, but honestly, mostly for a little bit of, it's very bland looking. It tastes really good. It's comforting and it's just homey, but it's completely one color. So I'm going to add some pepper just to get a little bit of interest in there. Now this is actually really delicious. Now if a Depression era family had happened to have some greenery growing somewhere in their kitchen garden, maybe some parsley or some chives, just a chop of that sprinkled over the top would be absolutely beautiful. They sometimes did have bacon in the Depression, and so that would be a good addition to this soup. If you had a little bit of bacon, they would just use a little bit. That's the thing. They wouldn't put a whole pound of bacon or a whole pack of bacon into something like this. They would just use a little bit to give it a little bit of flavor and make it stretch. They do have very small bags of real bacon bits at the store that I have used in Meals in a Bag before. So if you wanted to include something like that, that would be a great thing to include. Of course, that would just raise up the cost of the meal a little bit. But as is, this is a very warm, comforting, tasty, economical meal that is very much like something that would have been eaten during the Great Depression. And a rural family could have made this with ingredients they had raised on their own property, from their milk cow to the potatoes they grew right in the dirt of their own homestead. Another thing that you could add into this bag, this meal in a bag if you wanted, was a pack of crackers or a pack of oyster crackers or something like that. If that's something that you like to have on your soup, that's something that could actually stretch the soup a little bit further even and make it just a little bit more, even more substantial. We were surprised at how much we actually enjoyed these simple, frugal Depression recipes. Mr. Wicked Prepared's favorite was the Hoover Stew. Mine was the poor man's meal. Guys, that was honestly so delicious. The potato soup was probably the biggest shocker for me. It was so simple and unassuming, like most Depression era recipes, but I really didn't expect it to be so tasty in its simplicity. These are all recipes that we will keep on the shelf and be happy to eat. Now let's get into the price breakdowns. Keep in mind that some of the shelf-stable substitutions that we made to transform these into emergency meal grab-and-go kits are a little bit more costly than the fresh ingredients they might have used during the Great Depression. The canned potatoes, for example, cost more than that equivalent amount of fresh potatoes out of a 50-pound sack. But these recipes still came in at very budget-friendly prices. In figuring out the cost, I went with the cheapest price available to me in my area, which is usually going to be either Dollar Tree or Walmart's Great Value brand. Depending on where you live and what kind of sales your stores tend to have, you likely could do even better on these prices. All right, so the Hoover Stew. The tomatoes, 2 cans of tomatoes, 96 cents a piece. That's $1.92. For 2 cups of macaroni, I calculated that was 48 cents, buying the big box of macaroni. Corn for 64 cents. The Vienna Bites, $1.25 at Dollar Tree. And the broth was 76 cents. So that comes out to a total of $5.05. Like I mentioned, you could do a bouillon cube and a bottle of water and take that well under $5. The poor man's meal, all I needed was the luncheon meat. The Great Value brand of that's $2. And 2 cans of potatoes, 96 cents a piece, $1.92. I know you can do better than that on canned vegetables if you have good sales in your area. And I used about 10 cents worth, give or take, of that oil. So that comes out to a total of $4.02. The peanut butter bread. The peanut butter was $1.25 because that was a Dollar Tree bottle of peanut butter. Evaporated milk, $1.22. Flour, I calculated 22 cents worth of flour, 2 cups. I buy it in a 25-pound bag. Sugar, that was about 8 cents worth of sugar. Baking powder, 17 cents worth of baking powder. The salt was less than a penny, so I just did a penny. That was $2.95 for that peanut butter bread. And if you threw in the bottle of honey, that was from Dollar Tree for $1.25, you could do a jar of jelly. That jelly was something I made at home. So, you could do that with fruit you picked and do that really cheaply. So for just the bread though, $2.95 for that meal. The chipped beef gravy. This was the most expensive meal out of all of them because that little jar of beef was $3.86. Evaporated milk, $1.22. Crackers, $1.25 at Dollar Tree. I definitely didn't use that whole box for that amount of gravy, so you could do less than that. Flour, that was 4 cents worth of flour. I calculated 2 cents for the salt and pepper. It's less than that, but so it's $6.39 for the chipped beef meal. That was the only one that was really significantly more than $5. And the potato soup, the last meal, this was $1.25 for the carton of broth at Dollar Tree, $1.22 for the evaporated milk, 98 cents for the can of, 98 cents was the pouch of mashed potatoes, 96 cents for the can of diced potatoes, and that comes in at a total of $4.41, which is about $22.82 for all of those meals. So all 5 of those meals you can do for well under $25. And they were good serving sizes too. Those were not small meals. I hope you enjoy these meals if you try them. Be sure to come back and let me know if you do. What are some of your favorite struggle meals? Let me know down below. If you made it all the way to the end of the video, leave me one of these emojis down in the comments and check out this video next to see the emergency cooking kit that we keep stocked for preparing meals like this in an emergency. I'm Jara with Wicked Prepared. Survive today, thrive tomorrow. We'll see you next time.